Today is June 12th, and we're reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This passage has a lot to do with marriage, and there's several topics here: marriage and commitment and being content in whatever state you're in, and being spiritually minded, understanding the distractions of the world. All these things are covered in this single chapter here. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these things. His opening remarks is addressing, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He's addressing moral purity here, that especially as it pertains to men, that they are to conduct themselves in such a way as is reflective of a holy life and a holy man. And he also talks about, as we discussed in chapter 6, about fleeing immorality, and that we now are walking as Christ. He's trying to clarify, because the Corinthians have come out of a lot of paganistic thinking, and the culture was so corrupt, and marriage was not sacred, and so all these issues. So he's dealing with this oneness of marriage between a husband and a wife. He's dealing with sexual purity, both in and out of marriage. And then he's dealing with the subject of marriage and being content with that. And you'll see him make reference to this, if you're single, be content. If you're married, be content. And I think I reflect back to oftentimes the number of people that come to my office that are just not happy. They're not happy. I remember on one occasion, someone came in to talk to me, and they were married, and they were having problems in the marriage, and just miserable. And they've been agonizing over this a long time, just the conflict and the discord, and wanting so much just to have peace, just to be. He had remarked about how just wonderful it would be just to be alone, and so that person left, and soon after another person came in, and this person was a single person, and this person came in and said, I'm just so lonely, and it's just so quiet, and I don't have anybody in my life, and I just really believe that if I could just find somebody, person I could commit my life to and marry, that it would just be wonderful bliss. And I thought to myself as he was talking, I wish, the person just came in, I wish the two of you could get together and talk, because we oftentimes think that our situation, is miserable, and we don't think about all the different scenarios that are out there. But the issue here is that he's dealing with marriage, or principles of marriage, and the values of marriage, and then he talks about those that are married to keep their marriage vows. So he's dealing with the permanence of marriage. Now, we can't deny the fact that God's intent in the original design was that marriage would be for life, and that's God's design. But we also understand that things happen, and as a result of that, he's given to certain passages of scriptures for allowance when such conditions exist. And so we find this in verse 10. He said, a wife is not to depart from her husband. And so he's addressing permanence of marriage on that part. But then look in the very next verse, says, but even if she departs. In other words, these things are going to happen. The situations are going to arise. He uses in that same verse reconcile. That is, obviously, God's design is reconciliation. Brother, sister be reconciled. Husband and wife be reconciled. Reconciliation is the goal. But we understand that we live in a fallen world, and an imperfect people that we are, filled with flaws, that doesn't always happen. Now, he also says, verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now, he's sharing here that there are legal applications that associate self with marriage. That we understand the permanence of marriage is even written up in the law, and that if someone leaves or departs, then that releases that individual. Now he's making this as a spiritual application, is that, listen, if you're married and you have an unbeliever, and that person decides to leave and decides to remove himself from your life, you're no longer under bondage, and God is the author of peace, and he desires for us to experience peace. We're to be peacemakers. So we have to understand that there are situations and cases that are just irreconcilable, and we give those things over to God. But the emphasis in this passage right here, I believe, is that there is power in your testimony. With all that is within you, all that's possible within you, to live your life. So if you have an unbelieving partner, then the emphasis here is with all that's within you. Let your testimony be a witness. Let the reality of Jesus Christ in you become a powerful testimony to that unbelieving partner in your life. But at the same time, we got to understand that you and I have to come to a point of decision, and those are decisions that we can only make between ourselves and before God. He then moves us into live as we're called. Live, I mean, if you're married, then, remain married. If you're circumcised, then, remain circumcised, and uncircumcised, then remain uncircumcised. And that's why he says in verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling which he was called. And so some people felt like they were married and they got saved and they thought, my partner's not a Christian, so I'm going to divorce them and get out of it. And there were others who thought they were living in sin because they were married. And then there were some people that weren't married and thought they need to get married. All this confusion. And Paul's just bringing, hey, listen, you've got to be content. If you're single, be content. If you're married, be content. And if you're slave, be content. I mean, he just goes through the whole list of how to respond. Well, the reality here is that it's easy for us to become worldly minded. The Corinthians had been steeped in pagan traditions and rituals that had now crept into the church. And he's contrasting that by saying, okay, now it's time to be spiritually minded. It's time to look not from an earthly perspective, but from a kingdom of God perspective. Don't let all these things distract you. Don't let all these things move you in your relationship with Christ. So I think that the biggest thing we can take from this chapter is they understand the importance of whatever state you're in to be content. And that we make sure that our life is a living testimony to the glory of God. And that we not allow ourselves to become, hungry for things that we've not had, or chasing or searching after things that we think will bring more fulfillment to our life. But rather that we must live our life in our full contentment and fulfillment is going to have to come from our relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, listen, whatever state you're in, live it to the glory of God today.